If you don't mind if I keep my notes relatively close by, because there's a lot of information that I'd like to share with you guys this afternoon. Now, Philadelphia, alongside its sort of popular moniker as the city of brotherly love. Philadelphia, alongside being called sort of the city of brotherly love, has also been dubbed the city of neighborhoods. Now, Philadelphia is not unique in this regard. If we look at the major industrial cities of the Eastern Seaboard and the Midwest, including Chicago and Detroit, many of these cities were cobbled together over a series of years. I mean, Philadelphia gets its start, its northern border is Vine Street, and its southern border is South Street. Well, then how did Grace Ferry and, Frankfurt and all these other neighborhoods, get added? New York is the same way. Brooklyn was not a part of New York City at first. These cities slowly, over a series of years, were cobbled together, much like a Frankenstein monster, and stitched together and given life through the sort of electric pulse of the city. Now, with this process of geographic incorporation also comes demographic shift. And included within sort of the larger story of this larger Philadelphia story are the stories of many distinct ethnic and racial groups, among them being Puerto Ricans. Now, while New York City attracted the vast majority of Puerto Rican migrants from the island, Philadelphia had a small but steadily growing ethnic enclave before World War II. We often think of 1945 to 1965 as sort of the years of the Great Migration. And this is with good reason. Over 1 million Puerto Ricans left the island during this period. But Puerto Ricans have been here in Philadelphia for almost 100 years now, and we should recognize that. And they predominantly migrated to 3 distinct neighborhoods: Southwark, Northern Liberties, and of course, Spring Garden. Now, the migrants of this period between 1910 and 1940 were, for the most part, men, and for the most part, what we call skilled labor. These were cigar makers, all right? And why was Philadelphia the sort of center of the cigar-making universe? Well, there was a company here in Philadelphia called the Bayou Brothers, which was once located in Southwark by the docks. Why do you want your fabrica by the docks? Well, because the tobacco leaves are coming by ship, and freshness counts, folks. Now, Bayou eventually moved to Northern Liberties, and Puerto Rican migrants who came to Philadelphia before World War II went with them. Now, this of course is not the only industry that Puerto Ricans are involved in. You have a number of others who are working for Baldwin Locomotive, for example. But cigar making, I think, is unique for a lot of reasons. One, because it's skilled labor, but also two, because the cigar makers are amongst the most politically active and cohesive of the skilled labor sector during this period. We have to remember that there's a long history of sort of labor organizing in US history. And in particular, before World War II, what we call the interwar years, between World War I and World War II, there was a crackdown on urban ethnics, especially those from Southern and Eastern Europe. This is also the time of the first immigration reform, the Johnson-Reed Act, and a time when socialists, anarchists, and other kind of labor organizers were looked down upon, were frowned upon in American society. Now, here in Philadelphia, the cigar makers were organized into the Cigar Makers International Union Local number 165, which was located at 1334 Spring Garden. And the gentleman who ran this particular chapter was a gentleman by the name of Saturnino Gomez, who also owned a bodega and was one of the first Puerto Ricans to move out of Northern Liberties into North Philly proper. Now, he wasn't the only Puerto Rican involved. I mean, we have the records of Antonio Malpica, who also not only worked for Bayou, but he had his own independent workshop on Callow Hill Avenue. And so not only will he take piecework for other companies, but he would make his own cigars
Malpica cigars and sell them on the side. Now, the Cigar Makers International had a connection with Santiago Iglesias. Santiago Iglesias, of course, was the president of the Federación Libre de Trabajadores, which was the largest union, labor union on the island. And you know, some of you guys may not know this, but Santiago Iglesias, he had a political relationship with Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers might be one of the premier labor organizers of the AFL in the pre-World War II period. Now, while this aspect of the labor market was important, not only for labor organizing, but also just for sort of economic and social mobility, it was also a sector of the economy which was dwindling during the interwar years. In 1925, for example, 25% of the Puerto Rican men worked in cigar making here in Philadelphia, and that number had been reduced to 18% in 1940. Now, why was this dwindling sector of the economy so important? Well, I mean, if you guys have ever heard the stories of how these cigar makers made cigars, they're sitting at a table, they have a bunch of tobacco leaves, and all they have to do all day is just roll cigars. And if you and I had to do that, it'd be pretty boring. And so what are they doing? They're hiring, everyone chips in a nickel, and they hire the interwar year version of Audible.com. I don't know if you guys have Audible on your cell phone, but they would hire people like me to stand up in front of the room and read, the Yankees have crushed the Phillies in today's baseball game. I say that only because I'm a Yankee fan and in Philadelphia. But they were also reading the latest news, but they were reading literature. They had a fascination with Dostoevsky and Maxim Gorky. Why? Because this was the era of the Bolshevik Revolution. So they're getting political knowledge. They're getting cultural knowledge. And they're sitting there, what are you gonna do with people who you're gonna talk about things? Hey, what do you think about that one book? Hey, what do you think about what's happening over there in Russia? Hey, what do you think what's happening over there in Washington, D.C.? And this was a locus for political and union organization. And we see important figures in Puerto Rican history here in the United States. In particular, I'd like to highlight Luisa Capetillo, who was a woman very, very far ahead of her time, and perhaps one of the most important labor organizers on the island and amongst the US diaspora. Now, there were some push and pull forces working in the interwar years that encouraged Puerto Ricans to come here to Philadelphia, but also pushed Puerto Ricans out of the island. One, it was the era of the Great Depression, right? And as bad as things were here in the US, things were much worse in the Caribbean, right? So in general, overall, unemployment soared amongst all sectors of the labor market, but in particular for men on the island who were involved in the creation of unions. We're talking about 1,000 strikes just in the island of Puerto Rico alone, labor strikes during the Great Depression. But also the fact that women were becoming more important in terms of the production of cigars, all right? And so because there was less need for men, but there was this thriving cigar industry here in Philadelphia, well, it acted as sort of a natural magnet. And we begin to see the formation of this small enclave. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I get really, really bored of just going to work and going home. That's not living. That's just paying bills and working. And so when we talk about folks after their workday is done, well, what do they want to do? They want to go down to the supermarket and buy some ñame and batatas if they're, CI, all right? They want to pick up foods that they recognize. On Sunday, they want to go and worship in a language that they're comfortable with. Or maybe they want to go play a baseball game with people who can talk trash in Spanish. We begin to see a small nucleus of organizations take shape in this pre-World War II period that create a skeleton for the post-World War II migration that most of us know about. So, for example, right, on 3rd and Pine was an organization, we think about 3rd and Pine, we don't think of Puerto Ricans being down at 3rd and Pine, But 3rd and Pine, I know because I lived at 12th and Pine for like about a year after I graduated college. And I would park my car and walk around. I'm like, I could never picture Puerto Ricans in this part of town. And yet that was where La Fraternal was based out of. La Fraternal was an organization started by local community leaders, one for patriotic purposes, all right? And they raised money for World War II, and they allowed for other Puerto Ricans from across the diaspora here in Philadelphia to meet, all right? We also had, of course, I cannot forget La Milagrosa, all right? And the First Spanish Baptist Church, all right? And how they got started based upon the need to tend to the Spanish-speaking flock here in Philadelphia. These were perhaps the 2 most important organizations pre-World War II. Now, what happens after World War II? We see a number of important shifts taking place in American society. We see the shrinking of the manufacturing base as factories are moving to the Southwest and to the suburbs and eventually to abroad. We also see the changing of the landscape within the city. White flight and suburbanization are happening in the 1950s. We also have, in the island of Puerto Rico, the transition from the political status of territory to Commonwealth and the implementation of Operation Bootstrap, which was an industrialization program which wound up creating more unemployment than employment, ironically enough, all right? And this is one of the main contributors to the Great Migration. Now, I think it's also interesting that in this period of enhanced labor migration via contract labor, all right, for both men and women in the domestic service industry and later the garment industry, and men in the agricultural business, especially in the farms of South Jersey and Kennett Square. I think it's interesting that it takes until 1953 for the city of Philadelphia to finally notice that we had been here for at least 30 years. And it takes a race riot for that to happen, all right? So on July 17th, in 1953, there's a race riot in Spring Garden at 17th and Green. And as a result of this, Mayor Dilworth, they start paying attention and they write a report. And included in the writing of this report are interviews with local community residents and discussions with local community leaders like Jose de Chelis, the first Puerto Rican ever to graduate from Temple University with a degree in dentistry, who had been living here in Philadelphia since the 30s. He became one of the main leaders that the city of Philadelphia sort of looked to for guidance in trying to understand this Puerto Rican community. But why were the 1950s so important? Well, what else was happening? Lolita Lebrón had attacked Congress. There was an attempt on Truman's life, and it was 2 Puerto Ricans who tried to take the life of President Truman. So in this period, there's also a rebellion in Jayuya that takes place. In the midst of all this political strife on the island and within the diaspora, now there's a race riot. And people are waking up and wait a minute. There's about 5,000 Puerto Ricans here in Philadelphia? Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? And indeed, what it meant was what Thomas Segru, who's a historian who used to teach over at Penn, he called the 1950s a time of restrained integrationism. All right, this is the 1950s going into the early 60s, where we had Eisenhower and JFK. And so what was the approach of the city to this newly discovered Puerto Rican community? Well, let's approach them like good scientists. Let's study them. Let's try and understand what kind of jobs they have. Let's understand the kind of relationships that they have with their neighbors. But in addition to these sort of city-funded efforts, there were more grassroots efforts aimed at attempting this, for this new population to acculturate themselves to sort of local mores. So at Waring Elementary, for example, which in the 1950s, half of the students were Puerto Rican, and they only had 3 Spanish-speaking teachers, they would bring in a series of high school volunteers to serve as in-class translators. We also had the establishment by the Archdiocese of an organization which is still around today, Casa del Carmen, for example. But we also had forays into formal politics, all right? and into other areas of what we would now call sort of civil rights territory, specifically the issue of police brutality and equal housing, all right? So Jose Fuentes, who was the president of the Puerto Rican Civic Association, encouraged acculturation, but resisted assimilation. And one of the big issues that he was trying to tackle with his organization was this issue of police brutality, all right? So we have Puerto Rican men and women who come from a tropical environment, are used to hanging out outside on their doorstep, on the patio, hanging out, and maybe playing a little few numbers here, and maybe having a beer, and just talking about what's going on. And police would come and break this up because this was called loitering, all right? So there's a legal distinction that is criminalizing distinctly cultural activities, right? In addition, we had a woman named Emma Francesi who came to Philadelphia to work from the island. She had a master's degree in social work. When she first came to Philadelphia, she was working, of course, for the Friends Neighborhood Guild. The settlement houses, kind of like the house I used to work for back in the day. So the Friends Neighborhood Guild. And she eventually left the Friends Neighborhood Guild to work for the city. She was working for the Health and Welfare Council. And one of the problems that Emma Francesi tried to handle is this, the problem of lack of available housing for Puerto Ricans, because this is a fast-growing community. A community that was moving north in the early 50s and 60s into what we now know as the sort of lower North Philadelphia, between Front towards about 7th, if you're going from east to west, and slowly creeping north of that Girard line towards Cecil or Columbia Boulevard, and further north to Allegheny and Erie. And Francesi's approach was very similar to other Puerto Rican community leaders of the day. Let's learn the ways of the local folks here in Philadelphia. Let's not ruffle too many feathers while we're here. So she encouraged what we would now hear very clearly on Fox News as the sort of the ethic of personal responsibility. She wasn't trying to sort of curb systematic disenfranchisement through redlining and gentrification. She was sort of advocating as a social worker, sort of more one-to-one behavioral change as the solution for systematic discrimination. Now, it's within this kind of environment, after the assassination of JFK, with the rise of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who is the president who arguably has done more for civil rights legislation than any other president before or since, that we get the domestic program called the War on Poverty. So while he was escalating the war in Vietnam, he was trying to fight poverty at home. Some of you may remember when Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, had come out, and so there was a spotlight on the issue of poverty, not only in the inner city, but also in rural America. And to that end, LBJ created the War on Poverty program, which provided federal grants for local nonprofits in order to fight local issues surrounding poverty. The philosophy being that it's folks on the ground who have better solutions to fight poverty than folks in Washington, D.C. Now, this is the sort of economic pool of money where many of the organizations that we know that are still in existence here in Philadelphia are born. I'm thinking specifically of Concilio, all right? Because without Concilio, which helped create, the Puerto Rican Day Parade, that organization itself sprang up out of a number of smaller clubs. But without Concilio, we don't get Congreso, all right? And think about the impact of just those two organizations alone, and the fact that Concilio has moved from Fairmount now to Hunting Park. So rather than the neighborhood creating the organization and then the organization dictating what's going on in the neighborhood, the gradual shift north has pulled many of the operations of these organizations northward. Now, I can bore you with a lot of statistics, and I can continue to go into the 1960s and 70s, but I think it's important for us to understand, one, sort of the economic foundation of the community, one, the sort of the development of the social organizations, because it's from these organizations, the Aspiras, all right, that come into Philadelphia in the 1960s, the development of the Concilios, which bring in the Taller Puertorriqueños, which bring in the Congresos that come later on. And these organizations also help create a platform by which political leadership and elections can later be won in the 1980s. So much of what has been built upon the sort of bones of what was developed in the late 1950s, early 1960s. But we can't understand that crucial period of the post-war community development without discussing what happens in the interwar years. Now, with that, I'm gonna hand the mic off to Beth from the Historical Society. I wanna thank you guys for your time and for your patience. I know that's a lot of dry and dull history, but I think it's important that we have sort of a foundation by which we can begin to sort of look and think about the timeline that we're developing. So with that, without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Beth.